Ethan Nelson. How we doing, Ethan?
Good. How are you,
I'm
man?
so thrilled to speak with you again. I'm doing well, sir. I just picked up the car from the mechanic and I didn't lose all my money, just half of it. So that was good. And you never know, right? When you drop it off, you're like, oh gosh, please, please, because the service engine light came on. I really love the service engine light because you don't know if it's like a leaf that's stuck in the engine or if it's going to blow up in 10 seconds. It just kind of flicks and you're driving to work and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
the service engine light is too vague. It's just this yellow thing that comes up on your dashboard of the engine. It's that
Uh-huh.
little yellow light, and you have no idea what it means. Like I once had a kitten fall asleep in the engine of the car to stay warm in the winter. Yeah, service engine comes on. I don't know there's a kitten in the engine. I have no idea what it is. I get out, I open the hood. Kitten literally jumps at me, dodge it, and it was a barn cat kind of kitten, so it's crazy. And then it was on the eye, and it's got like its little crazy kitten eye, and then it ran off into the floor. So I was fixing a service engine light. I like your haircut. How have you been, by the way?
Thank you. I've been good. I've been good. Yeah, lots been going on, doing lots
Nice,
of writing these days.
nice,
Started a book,
excellent.
so I'm about 40,000 words into this book and starting to just every single day sit down and like that's like my morning ritual now is just like 500 to 1,000 words
Good.
on the book, and it's really enjoyable to go from like kind of like newsletter type writing to like really long form, like trying to really synthesize and structure a lot of different ideas, and it feels like I'm building my coherence of thought a lot more, and it just feels really intellectually satisfying.
Extremely thrilled to hear. I definitely think, Mr. Nelson, that not enough people in the intellectual spaces do a morning routine of writing. I think I've written, I do that every day. I think it is unbelievably important because I just don't simply, I think speaking, reading, and writing, we talked about this before, have
Yeah, yeah.
a relationship that informs one another. And if you don't write, you're probably overestimating how coherent all the ideas in your head are. You
Right,
probably
right, right.
are because you're just thinking to yourself, it's like, oh no, I know how those all fit together. But when you put it on a piece of paper and you have to bring the threads and then you say, oh, wait, that idea opens up an entire, oh, shoot, I got to address that. Oh, that opens, oh gosh. And you see the opening of an idea and how one
Yeah,
thing leads
yeah.
to, it's very difficult in your head to do that, like to really see how everything, but when you write, you go, oh, and then you get the joy of the accomplishment of bringing those things together
Right,
that you really don't get in the head, because even if you do bring a lot of things together, you don't get that feeling of, yes, I brought the sentences together, yes, I brought it, which can be very
right.
motivating and very
Mhm.
encouraging. I really do think that practice, it's the ecology of practice for Veggie Talk. That is like an incredibly important practice for those who
Absolutely.
are on the logo side, more on the logo side, dare I say. You obviously all the sides you need, but if you have the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
natural disposition for doing that kind of work, it is so important to do writing. And actually, I would say if you're more on different personality, you need to do journaling. Like there's journaling, there's writing kind of an academic book, there's nonfiction, there's
Right.
fiction. I have never met a person who I am of the opinion would not benefit from a writing practice of some kind, because
Absolutely.
writing is where you're alone with your own thoughts, but you're not alone in the same way. Like when you're alone with the thoughts in your head, they just kind of hamster wheel and they don't
Yeah, yeah,
necessarily make
yeah.
any progress. But when you're alone with your thoughts in a way where you're alone to witness them, it's almost like as I'm talking, it's almost like the difference between kind of being alone and stuck in, as opposed
Mhm.
to alone and kind of witnessing, and a kind of
Yeah,
alone in
yeah,
a
yeah.
kind of monastery almost
Yeah,
way.
absolutely. And one of the thinkers that I like, Ken Wilber, he uses his terminology of what you just said, turning the subject into object. So he's like
Mm,
the journaling or the writing is like you're consistently turning the subject into an object, and then you're just
mm.
like you're seeing your experience of the world as an object on the paper, just like flowing. And like I always love that, and I always resonated with that, like turning the subject into an object. And he says that that's like the nature of like the developmental process is, developing through life is like consistently turning subject into object. And same thing with meditation. He says meditation is also like you have these thoughts in your head and you're just like witnessing them. And in the same way, writing is kind of like I see it as a very meditative practice.
Well, that's fair enough. I did not realize that Mr. Wilbur had done that work. I'm a big fan. Michelle and I have talked about where like writing is where you're taking like your thoughts and turning them into objects in the world. I like the idea of
Yes.
emphasizing the stuff.
Yes.
Well, and it goes to show you, frankly, there that you can't make a simple dichotomy where you say subject good, object bad, or objectification is bad. It depends on what you mean by that. Obviously, objectifying
Right.
others is bad. In the
Right.
same
Right.
way, we were talking at the net the other day that having kind of unconditional standards to others can be bad because then you allow injustice, evil, and Hitler, right? But when you turn unconditionality on yourself and you say, I'm going to be someone who doesn't have conditions for encountering people, I'm not going to be someone who has conditions that the world has to meet to encounter me, and you turn unconditionality on something that forces you to rise to being someone who doesn't set conditions for the world, well, then unconditionality is transformative. Likewise, if you take objectification and instead of objectifying other to your ends, you turn it on yourself to engage in practices of turning your subjectivity into an object, well, that can be transformative. So it's really interesting. You know, I was always really taken by kind of Augustine's emphasis that there's nothing evil in the world, it's all disordered goods. So really things like everything is actually kind of a matter of ordering. Like even objectification, which is extremely bad when it's put on others, actually when put on yourself to create a process of kind of meditation is extremely good, right? Unconditionality, which could run the risk of being overly permissive, when turned on you, actually becomes something that makes you more open to the other person. And it's really, I think, important to think of things in the world in terms of, well, if it exists, there's probably some good way to use it. Maybe not much. It's hard to imagine where mosquitoes are good, right? They cause so much malaria. But, you know, you always at least are trained to have a little opening in your thought to think about, wait, maybe there's a matter of ordering. Maybe there's a way to approach this in a manner that can actually be sublimative or constructive or positive. And I definitely think, well, one of the reasons that causes so much mental chaos is precisely a lack of grounding. Like you're kind of overly a subject, right? You're an unbound subject that can just think all the time. But when you objectify, like when you turn it into an object, it creates a kind of grounding structure that helps you avoid existential chaos, right? And so there's something really, I think, important about that kind of practice. And I really like, you know, that's a great incorporate. I'll give, you know, what Mr. Wilbur is saying there, because I definitely experienced that. And it also definitely forces you to get out of it. If you do that, you're also less prone to self-deception. Like you're less prone to thinking you have a good idea. When you don't, you get in a habit. One of the most important things of writing is rewriting. You get in a habit of realizing that your first idea is probably not right, and it has to be redone. So you get a kind of healthy self-skepticism also in your own mind that goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, and I wanted to riff on this a little bit too, because it feels like to me, like writing, like most of the time I write, it doesn't feel like good writing, but every once in a while I'll be like, oh, like after I went through enough iterations of just like putting out crap on the paper, then now something good has come. That's like kind of how I relate to my writing practice. It's like I'm just like consistently churning out like pretty bad ideas and stuff, and then but because I'm consistently churning them out, eventually it's like this iterative process, and then I strike gold somewhere, and then I'm like, oh, that's really good, delete all of the crap from the last week, here's the gold, now let's elaborate on this and go through this process. And it's just like picking out the wheat from the chaff. And you know, and I really like, you know, the emphasis on rewriting, because, you know, I was listening to this lecture, this lecture at a college, talking about, you know, how he was teaching his students how to write. And he's basically saying like, it's stupid. Some professors teach their students to like write an outline and then write the thing. He's like, when I was in college, I always wrote the thing and then the outline afterwards. And I'm like, that makes so much sense to me. Like, I'm going to write the whole thing, and then I'm going to see all the ideas and the through lines, and then I'm going to actually create a structure out of the mess. I can't create a structure with a blank page, you know? And I just thought that was great, and I resonate with that.
Yeah, you know, the way that they teach writing, I could say a bunch of things. It is truly, so basically the way they teach the humanities, literature, philosophy, writing is the exact way you need to teach it to make everyone hate it. And precisely, it might be a STEM conspiracy to make everyone come to math and science. I don't know, because you make everyone, like, if you teach Hamlet to memorize characters and what was the action and the climb, no one gives a crap. You know, but if you say, hey, man, look at this Iago guy in Othello, isn't it crazy that if someone uses rationality in an unbound way, you get stuck in something you cannot escape and end up like abandoning the person you love most of all? Isn't it nuts? I listened to your talk with Zoe on the reality distortion field. Othello is a magnificent example of the reality distortion field in the character of Iago. And Iago also kind of points to the Satan figure in Milton and different things, this sort of elegance and this ability to create a self-referential logic that Othello cannot escape. Well, you know, that's interesting now. Oh, maybe this Shakespeare guy has something to say, right? But if you don't get into that and instead just make people bored out of their mind because they have to memorize random sections and characters, then nobody cares. Likewise, if I tell you, hey, writing is you have a thesis, and then you have 4 sentences, and you have an opening. So then you don't care. And that's the thing. But really, this is quite bad, because if indeed the complexity of the world is going up, therefore the responsibility to substantively participate in democracy is going up. And writing is basically the only way, might be the only way, really close to the top, to organize your thought to handle complicated fashions. And if you have a culture that doesn't have regular practices of writing, or even thinking in a writing fashion, because writing will change how you think. If you have a culture that doesn't do those things, it's very unlikely the democracy will be functional, or that people will be able to organize their lives.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot too, how I've been, one of the guys that I listen to a lot has influenced my thinking. Schmachtenberger on this a lot has been like, he basically proposes that, you know, all of the parts of the government are supposed to check each other, and then the people are supposed to check it. Right now, the reason there's corruption and all this stuff is because the people aren't checking it, you know. And it's like it's on runaway power dynamics and runaway, you know, all these bad you know, power dynamics are happening because it's like the people aren't. And I think that's what just came up for me when you said like writing is a way to have a functioning democracy, is like with increasing the education of the populace actually creates a stronger check in power to the structures that are, you know, that feel like they're above us at times.
Oh well, completely. And you know, you have that old saying that the pen is mightier than the sword or whatever, which Indiana Jones made fun of. But there is a kind of truth to that, because pens tend to send swords off. Someone writes something, and that's why the armies are deployed, right? You know, that's why the sword is used in the way that it is. You know, the pen directs the sword, right? And it directs not just one sword, it tends to direct many swords. And because it directs minds, the pen directs minds. Like people, it's actually hard. And I know we're going to talk about the gift economy. This topic's really fascinating, though. It's really actually what can actually occur is you actually don't appreciate how much your way of thinking is influenced by stuff that other people wrote. Like, you know, like you really don't realize that the background of your thinking is because of, say, people like Immanuel Kant. Like the average person in America is a Kantian and doesn't even know it. They believe you can't access the things in themselves, or therefore you can only have science to know truth, or it has to be more of just like a kind of religious faith that isn't bound by phenomenon, right? So the role of kind of conceptual mediation or philosophical reasoning is right off the table, because it's all been killed by Kant, basically. Like, because Kant leads you into scientism and pragmatism, you know, Richard Rorty, all these different people, and basically that's what everyone is. And you don't even realize it, right? That this guy named Immanuel Kant basically created the modern world. And if you're an American, you can even talk about things like the Declaration, obviously, the Federalist Paper. Like there's like notions of freedom that you kind of accept and absorb. Those all come from books that you may not have even read, but create the atmosphere in which you think. And it's so actually all pervasive that it doesn't seem like it's at play, right? It's kind of invisible. And it's not merely because everyone, you know, you go to a public school. It's not merely that. No, people in conversation discuss these ideas and reinforce these ideas to one another, which come from these old books. And it makes me think of Randall Collins' work. It makes me think of James Hunter's work on like Faithful Presence and Change the World, where they all are just like, hey, the ideas that they were saying back then, it's like a 3-decade time period. Like what's being taught in 1970 is what's being written in 1970 will be what the average person is talking about in 2000. And I think Dr. Hunter has actually kind of said it's shrunk now. It's like 20 years, maybe even 10 years because of the internet and the acceleration. But like what people do, it's not immediate, but it trickles. And here's the thing. If you yourself are not writing, then you're going to absorb what trickles and have no defense against it. Like you're not even going to realize you're doing
uh-huh.
it. That's the other, you're just going to be
Right,
captured in a
right,
kind of
right.
Deleuzian sense.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I know we'll get onto the gift
Gift
economy
economy,
stuff in a
yeah.
second, but this is also one of the main topics of the book, which is and I really, this is where I think I can learn from you a lot, and where I'm really fascinated to pick your brain on this is like I have this like very clear sense in my mind that like how I understand the world has been shaped by things that are not me, that have shaped by culture, experience that my worldview is being shaped by so many things that are outside of my control on a cultural level, on a, there's so many of these like core fundamental beliefs and assumptions about how the world works that I'm not aware of, that are just people act as if it's reality, or as if this is how the world works. And like you said, like in conversation, we're reinforcing these like very, very core beliefs and assumptions without even knowing that they themselves are beliefs or assumptions, or that we can actually question them. And so I've been really, especially on the topic of like ontology, like how my sense of self and its relationship to the world, how that is being shaped by like so many cultural things, and I'm not aware of them. And I haven't really had the time in my life to go into all of the different philosophical figures in schools of thought that have shaped that. But I just have this sense that that's the case, and I would love to pick your brain on like at some point like more of the specifics of which different schools of thoughts are shaping, ontology and my perception of the world and my relationship to the world. And especially as it relates to the meaning crisis, I think that we have had a lot of talks on the meaning crisis. And to me, like there's so many cultural beliefs and assumptions that I think are making us feel like the world is meaningless, but actually that we just think it's how the world works. But if we question them, I think we could actually start helping people find meaning and giving talking about different ways of generating meaning, because we're getting at the core beliefs and assumptions of who we are, what is my relationship to the world, morals, ethics. It's just fascinating to me.
Well, we're going for gold, aren't we, Mr. Nelson? So that's all outstanding. I appreciate those topics. I think those topics are extremely important because what you're getting at, so there's a few things. Like the conflict of mind, the trilogy called The Truism, the Rational. The third book is also called The Map is Indestructible. And by maps, we're talking about ideologies, worldviews, and how exactly they function. And how can you really believe anything if what you believe is always situated within an embedded culture or axioms or different things like that, right? And what is the difference between, say, something, what does it mean to even know something? Like if I say that I know this is a laptop, well, if I were to give it to a dog, they would pee on it. Because it's not a it's not a computer. Like laptop is not what the phenomenon really is to them, right? It's like to be used as such is relative to the human. So here's the thing. What things are ontologically or factually is situated within what I am. So ontology and epistemology are always very profoundly linked. And that's kind of one of the things that has hurt philosophy, I think, is actually separating like ontology and epistemology. Because once you do that, epistemology is basically just going to become rationalism, because you're going to treat, mental models, how the brain works kind of independent of the whole lived experience and ontology of the being of the human. And so you're going to get a brain on a stick. And then of course the problem is when you bring back that brain on a stick to you and your ontology, there's a mismatch and that leads to what I call autonomous rationality, which can be very totalizing and very, very problematic. So it's really important to keep these together. Also, ethics, morality, aesthetics, all of these are conditioned by ontology. Like
Yeah, totally.
what is ethical to do is relative to what is fitting for the human to do, or what the human can do, or what's fitting for human community, right? Like pandas, for example, to dominate, to determine their territory. I don't know, I'm using a lot of pea examples, will pea higher up on the tree, and whichever panda can pea highest up on the tree is who owns that little area, right? That's not a way that human beings mark off their territory, right? They have contracts, they have law, and yet it would be silly to say that's wrong of the panda to do, because what a panda is a being of which marks off its territory as such. So ethics is how, and also to judge the intelligence of a panda or its epistemological methods according to human standards would be quite unfair. Like if you were to say, well, panda, you're really dumb because you never played GoldenEye on the N64 and don't know how to use that controller. Wow, you're really dumb. That would not be fair to the panda, right? So it's all relative to like what we are and what we do. But of course, that begs the question, What is the human? What exactly defines the human? And this is why the debate, for example, individual or delusion individual, or relations are primary to identity, or are we dialectical, or are we going to synthesize? People don't realize that if you move a piece in one area, that moves all the pieces in all the areas, right? Like you can't do ontology independent of epistemological ramifications. And you can't do epistemology without assuming or implying something ontological, which then, of course, has impacts on how humans experience beauty or what kind of beauty they can experience. So what makes what's really important, I think we're basically now at an age where, like, if one does philosophy, it's kind of unacceptable. It's kind of like out of date to separate the fields in a way. Like there was a time where separating them could generate thought and it had a kind of value. In the same way, you know, there's a whole lot of critique of reductionism, right? Like reducing things, and there should be, because reductionism can create a lot of nihilism. At the same time, reductionism as a method to study one thing independent of its network to learn about it is precisely why science took off, right? Like that was a really useful tool to help science took off. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for humans not to overfit, meaning when we find something that works, then we want to use it all the time, even if it destroys us. We overfit it. So reductionism as a mental tool to focus, if you tie reduction to focus, that can be useful. But unfortunately, reductionism becomes a kind of religious dogma, and then everything is the parts. And so what has happened now? Now it's an ontology. Oh, well, if it's an ontology, now it's an epistemology, and it just happens to be the only epistemology is science. Oh, now you have a world that is merely like scientific facts. Everyone is just facts, and now people feel existentially depressed and alone and fragmented, right? Because a worldview that emphasizes facts almost has to fragment, because the parts are pulled apart. You know, they're kind of like pulled apart. So like an emphasis on facts almost has to fragment. So, I mean, reductionism as a scientific tool is actually very useful, but precisely because it's so useful, it's tempting to then use it all the time, even if it destroys us all, kind of nihilistically or different things like that. And so that's the problem. Like the very effectiveness then leads us to falling into the temptation of overfitting it, as opposed to keeping it in its bonds, right? So likewise, like what ends up happening is like it's very important to sort of not be caught up in the effectiveness of the epistemology and take the effectiveness of that epistemology as evidence of the truth of ontology. So what ends up happening, you say, oh, if we can learn so much useful information by reductionism in science, then that must mean things are just their parts. That means they must be reducible to their parts, because otherwise you couldn't get this effective information. Well, now you've fragmented everything into just facts, and they don't have a network effect or in a relation between those different facts, and you get a lot of the trouble that you see today, right? Of the reductionism and the kind of atomization, and you don't even have any space for complexity theory emerging, all those different things. So what ends up happening is we tend to do this thing where we derive our ontology from the effectiveness of an epistemology. We say, oh, this epistemology is effective, therefore we must be beings of whom are primarily are the reduced parts, right? So likewise, if people feel like certain religious knowledge gives them insight into the world, then they would say, oh, well, we are the kind of beings that only need this religious knowledge, right? Where what really you have to do is always keep your eye on the ball of both epistemology and ontology at the exact same time. You have to keep your eye on the ball constantly, right? As opposed to separating them, and always keep in mind that as you talk about ontology, you're also talking about epistemology. And as you talk about epistemology, you're always talking about ontology, and then obviously aesthetics and so on and so forth. Why that is really, really important is because if we define ourselves according to our epistemology, that inherently means we only use that epistemology, and now we're in a reality tunnel. Now we're in a reality distortion field, just like he was saying. So, you know, that's what ends up happening, because that's the only epistemology, right? And your being, your identity is tied to that epistemology, and now you're stuck in it. It's the only way to think, right? And so if you're not exercising that thought, you're not being true. And so to be true, you then stay in this wheel, this self-justifying sort of system. And that's what ends up happening. But then on the flip side, if you go, oh, well, it's actually all arbitrary because we're just kind of absorbing it from our environment and stuff like that. Well, now you fall into epistemic nihilism, where you say, oh, all knowledge is just kind of secondhand smoke. We're just kind of absorbing it from the world around us, and therefore we don't actually know anything in any way whatsoever. And that leads to, you know, a lot of trouble, because then you're kind of hopeless. You're like, oh, I can't know anything or anything like that. And then, you know, people fall into nihilism. So there's a ditch on either side of the road. So the question is, and then I'll give it back to you. Oh, and before I forget, the other thing is, if you don't write, you also don't take the time to become aware of your own reason for valuing things or what your values are. And so if you exist in a culture that like money is primary, then you're not going to enter into gift thinking, right? Because you're just going to absorb the metric of the society. So things like writing open you up to possibly different metrics. So we'll point to that later. But, you know, writing is another thing that makes you think outside the metrics and valuations of the culture. But if indeed we are human beings that are always absorbing things around us, and you say, oh, it's actually not possible to not do that, well, then what must the nature of knowledge be, if there is such thing as knowledge, as opposed to just absorbing things around us, right? So if you take this question seriously, and you also take seriously that the nature of knowledge has ontological implications, then you start asking, wait a minute, maybe what we think knowledge isn't exactly what knowledge is. And maybe human beings are not merely entities that are absorbing and memorizing facts. Maybe there's something more that's going on. Maybe our very participation in coming to terms of truth is an active component in what that truth is. And assumptions are the necessary steps on the staircase we have to make to even begin the journey. Because you have to start from somewhere, right? You know, Thomas Nagel has that book where he says view from nowhere, and he's like, it's literally not possible to have a view from nowhere, right? So we have to start from somewhere. But wherever we start from is going to be absorbed by the world around us. But here's the key. If certainty is impossible, that actually means we can't say for sure that those assumptions are bad, right? Whereas if certainty is possible, then we necessarily will not experience those assumptions as things we're certain about once we're conscious of them, which means we must deconstruct them. So this is where, for me, the first step in this question is deconstructing the notion of certainty in favor of confidence. Because if you believe certainty is possible, then you're always going to be looking to start from a place of certainty as opposed to starting from a place of assumption. Well, since certainty is not possible, that means you're always going to be looking for a place to start, and you never start. You never get around to starting. And you can't go anywhere. And then you end up just Descartes stuck by that oven in his basement or different things. Because you say, you know, I think, therefore I am. It's like, well, where'd that I come from, Descartes? Maybe your thinking is thinking, therefore thinking. Right? You know, there's always these presuppositions that are kind of below the surface. But the fact that there are presuppositions and assumptions and axioms does not necessarily mean that one is wrong. That means one has work to do. So the first step in the question, I think, is the realization that, you know, is realizing that ontology and epistemology are always linked. They're always connected. You always have to keep in mind that if you move one piece, you're moving a piece everywhere. And then the second thing is to realize the name of the game is not certainty, but confidence, which then allows one to not spend all their time looking for a starting place of certainty that you never find. You work with the assumptions, you work with what you've absorbed, and go from there. So now you actually can advance in thinking because you have reason to say, well, I have confidence to think that these assumptions work enough to help me function in the world because I'm not dead yet and I'm not starved to death. So there's reason to think there's enough truth to these assumptions to allow functionality. But you can't ever say that it must be all the truth because you can't have certainty. So, like, dissolving certainty from your thinking allows you to have a starting place, and it also keeps you from being a fundamentalist. It has a double function. You can start somewhere, and also you see, you can start, but then you can't end where you start. Because if you start saying, oh, I assume these things, well, they must be the truth. Well, that's certainty. How do you know that, right? So it's really important to realize that the name of the game is competence. To engage in a way of life that gives you reason to think that what you think has something to do with truth, but not so much that then the other person has nothing to teach you, right? Where from a place of confidence, I can confidently stand in what I think, but not in a manner that closes off the other. In fact, the other can teach me something because I don't have certainty. So I need the other. They may teach me something. So I think the first thing I would say is to go the name of the game. So what we are doing in thinking. So this is my main point. Because, you know, I said that we may have gotten wrong what exactly thinking is in the business of. I would argue that we mostly think that the business of thinking is certainty. to find things that we know is true and that are certainly true. That's what we've been kind of taught to believe, especially in a kind of STEM culture and different things, right? No, thinking is not in the business of certainty. Thinking is in the business of confidence to allow further thinking of itself to engage its own creative act, of which seems to be necessary for the ontology of what the human being is. Now, that was a very loaded sentence with a lot of fancy terms, but the main point is to say that thinking is not in the business of certainty. Thinking is in the business of confidence, and then something more than that. And so we have to kind of get out of our head. And I think it's kind of funny. Blondel in his book Action is really good on this. He makes the point where he says, you know, just as soon as thinking gains certainty, it doesn't care anymore. Like, just as soon as you're certain of something, you're not interested. Like, and it's really funny, because if our goal is certainty, basically our goal is boredom. Like, I don't think about this doorknob because I'm certain it works. You know, when I say certain, I have enough of a feeling that it will work that I don't care about it anymore. Right? So, like, the irony is that certainty actually makes me not care. Like, I stop caring when I have certainty. So if the goal of thinking is certainty, the goal of thinking is to kill itself. The goal of thinking is to make thinking no longer interested in thinking. So it is a terrible goal. And I think it actually leads, it's like really bad, because certainty is not even possible. And yet if you think it's possible, there are things where you can get enough confidence that it's practically certainty. Like, I'm pretty confident this laptop's not going to blow up in a minute, right? I'm not certain, but I'm 99.999% confident that it won't, right? So that's a kind of practical certainty, even if it's not technically certainty. You understand what I'm saying? And the conflict of mind makes that. So the point is, but the thing is, when I get practical certainty, I stop caring. I don't care anymore. I don't even think about it. Thinking stops caring. So literally, we have made the goal of thinking its effacement. We've made it like its lack of motivation to continue itself is what we've made the goal of thinking. Well, guess what? We've then made the ontology of, if epistemology always has ontological ramifications, then we basically conditioned ourselves to think that the goal of the human is to get to a place where they don't care anymore. Like, that's the purpose of life. The meaning of life is to get to a place where you don't care anymore. You know, you don't care anymore. You don't care. Like, the meaning of life is to get to a place where you don't care about the meaning of life. Right? The goal of thinking is to get to a place where you don't care to think of anymore. So that certainty has been a particularly dangerous notion in thought, both for humans and for epistemology.
Right.
But yeah, no, when the goal of thinking is certainty, the goal of thinking is death. Likewise, what that does is then bleed over into our ontology, where the goal of being human is to reach a place where you no longer have to care about being human anymore, because you quote unquote know what it is to be human, or you don't care about meaning anymore because you have meaning. But so then you die. Like, the goal becomes its own end. It destroys itself. So it's a major problem.
Yeah, there's so much that I want to I wanted to riff on here. Glitchy internet, 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 glitchy internet. This is the glitchy internet song. This is the glitchy internet song. Glitchy, 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 glitchy. Raining outside. It makes the internet die because it's raining outside. Glitchy, glitchy internet. Glitchy, glitchy internet. He's back. He's back. Maybe internet will work. Guitar solo to banatuna. Yeah, totally. In all the things you said, there was so much that was coming up. And like one of the first things that came to me was like, it always feels like I never fully feel certain about my knowledge and about how the world works. You know, so like when I'm sitting down to write every morning, it's always like there's some feeling of like incompleteness. Like, I'm not really sure what's gonna come out. My ideas aren't coherent. And I know when you were talking about certainty versus competence, like I feel like I have enough something in my mind to put words on the paper that are going to end up in something meaningful, but I'm not really sure what they are, and I have no certainty about them. So I was like really sitting with like what the biggest thing that stops me from writing is feeling like I need to have certainty before I start. And you know, if I know that I'm not going to have certainty, but I'm just like going to let stuff flow out, then there's like you said, competence. There's some like feeling of competence there, but it's like utterly not certain at all. And Yeah, and then related to like you know, in a more like philosophical school, certainty, that sort of thing. I was brought to mind of this quote, which is that, or I heard someone say once that, you know, all like the skeptics, he was talking about like the school of thought, like the skeptics, and he was like, the skeptics are skeptical of everything but skepticism. And so it really like rung true with me of like, it's easy to be skeptical of the certainty of everything else, except that yet their worldview is completely certain to them, and they're not skeptical of their own worldview and like turning it in on themselves. And in the same way, it feels like, yeah, like that's how I was relating to what you were saying there. And then I had a couple of points here on the gift economy stuff, and as it relates to kind of you know, the economic system reductionism, a lot of the threads that you were talking about just now, I feel like we can weave the gift economy stuff into the conversation here. And you know, I think I after you reached out to me about the gift economy piece, I recorded it like a year and a half ago. My thinking has like changed so much since then, and I was sitting with it and I was trying to figure out like, all right, now I actually like disagree with a lot of the stuff that I said, but also there's like this like fundamental like feeling that I was talking from, and I was kind of sitting with that. And a lot of what with the gift economy, and as you kind of brought it up, is that in the modern, like in the modern sort of economic capitalist structure, it feels like we tend to reduce all of human relationships down to economic transactions, right? And I think that was what I was speaking against, was really like, it feels like we should not just reduce all of our relationships down to economic transactions, like, oh, you owe me something, I want something from you, all right. And like I the guy that I took the idea from, Charles Eisenstein, he like really like inspired me with the idea. He kind of goes into in his book around how like community versus alienation, and how like in the past we had such a stronger sense of community because you would go to the same, you know, butcher, in the same bakery, in the same everything every single day, and like everyone was in a small enough community that you actually had like relationships with all of these people, and you were doing transactions, like, but there was also something more, you know. And then in the modern world, we've kind of extracted that and turned it into corporations, and now you have zero relationship with, you know, the clerk at the grocery store, or like we can get all of our needs met, you know, our food, our housing, our security, everything that we need without having any relationships with those people. So it kind of turns our survival, like everything we're doing in our lives to survive, into completely just transactional relationships. And so I think that like, I feel like there's this necessity to bring something else into our relationships out, and to stop like reducing them down to just like economic behavior, and actually like, oh, like what is this like aesthetic, beautiful dialogos, philosophical kinship, like kind of Vervaekian like philosophical friendship of like, or you know, or obviously family is another one, and just like how can we like give to others in a way that has nothing to do with economics, but like really making that more central than the sort of like economic frame for relationships.
Magnificent. A few things. One, I'm very glad you brought up the topic of writing and the question of competence, because that is one of the most important practices, to realize that you don't need certainty, that you in fact can function on competence. And in fact, competence is great. Where certainty in writing, like if you need certainty to begin writing, you never start. Like you never start the story, where you have to have enough of a sense of how the story is going to go, if I'm speaking from creative writing, to make it go. But if you have too much of an idea, the characters die, because they're not allowed to unfold freely as the characters would, right? And you have to work from a place of competence. And also too, like when you get into super long papers, like you're not certain of all the angles it will go, but you're confident enough that you can keep going. Writing is a uniquely useful practice for showing how the life of confidence unfolds, how thinking unfolds in terms of confidence. I really do think, and I've spoken with Mr. Luber about this a number of times, is that the phenomenology of the artist, the phenomenology of artistic practices, are kind of a unique harvesting field for the new kind of philosophical thinking that's going on. Like if you really examine the phenomenology of what it's like to write a story, like if you really pay attention to that, you can see kind of the new kind of way when we start talking about how does the subject and object divide get removed and the human kind of exists not reducible to that. What does it look like to live according to competence and not certainty? What does it look like to be intrinsically motivated? What does it look like to be motivated by a sense of beauty or the harmony? We'll pay very, very close attention to the act of writing itself. One of the big mistakes is a lot of people have paid attention to stories, but not the act of writing a story. We paid a lot of attention to paintings, but not the act of painting. It's the act, the creative act, that is a unique source of new ideas phenomenologically. And if you pay attention to that, you'll see the blending of the kind of dance between the emergent and the focus, and you forget the subject and flow, but then you come back to incorporate your biography into the story, and then you go back. You see the gymnastics of the way the mind has to move to really take seriously this new kind of development after postmodernity that people are kind of circling, and they've metamodernity, these different called like the creative act, not the creative product, the creative act and the experience of beauty, not merely what we call beautiful. That's been a big mistake. We spend so much time asking, is Beethoven's Ninth beautiful? That then you get kind of down a rabbit hole of kind of defining beauty, as opposed to the first time you heard it, and you didn't expect to hear it, and the strike of beauty in that experience. What is that experience like? Not merely the question, is Beethoven's Ninth? We paid way too much attention to the question of beauty we paid way too much attention to asking, is a thing beautiful, as opposed to what occurs in the experience of beauty. That's an entirely different matter. And that's what we need to examine very, very closely to kind of deal with these different questions. Because indeed, if the human being is capable of the creative act and the undergoing of beauty, then that means they must have an ontology that allows them to so undergo that, which then means they must have an epistemology that allows them to undergo that. And so what is the human being? You have to ask the question, defining the human being as a being of whom can enter into this very strange trance space of writing a story. Not merely the question of, are they a rational agent? And then you get the economic man, the homo rationet, that then leads to a lot of reductionists. Or you say, oh, man is someone who wants to know. Well, that's good, but that can lead you to pure scientism, right? Like to be like an Aristotle, like man is a rational. Well, that's all fine. Man can frickin' write a story, and they can enter a really weird trance space where they do that. And that's the space where the subject object, that's like that Heidegger's like, we got to get rid of the subject object divide. Guess what? In the act of writing a story, the subject object divide vanishes. So that's where you want to look. And in the same way, in the creative act in the economy, like if you're inventing something, then in the act of invention, value and price come together. Like economic man and your own valuations come together. You know, it's not merely reducible to price, but it's also not merely reduced to a subjective value, because you're creating it in the world. It is there. The creative act is what the human ontology needs to be defined according to, and then the epistemological ramifications of that, of which then will feed back. And basically, the creative act is also a radical kind of gift, right? When you write something, what are you doing? You're creating a gift to give to the world, right? You are gifting in the act of creativity, and you are also thinking in terms of a non-zero sum gift. You're not, so when I give you $50, if I give you a gift of $50, I lose $50. But if I give you a story, we both benefit, because I want you to read it, and this is why I made it. And so the creative act also is very important for a mature conversation about like gifting in terms of an economic structure, or the human as needing something about gifting. Because, you know, there's two ways to go about the question of gifting. And it's very, very interesting when you go back to, say, the Torah, that you had things like gleaning, right? Like there was a part of the field that they would leave, that the poor would come and get, right? Like when you harvest, you're responsible for leaving a certain percentage of the field unharvested so that the poor or the needy can come and get food, right? And you go through the religious traditions and you have this kind of emphasis on tithing. You can even view sacrifice as a kind of like giving, right? You can view certain forms of it. Now, it depends on the Girardian analysis. I'm aware of that. But the kind of language, if we stick with the Torah, at least, is very much this something that's kind of saying the human being does not properly develop if they don't have gifting as part of their very lifestyle. Right? Like something doesn't function if the human doesn't give. And it's very, very interesting. I mean, you can get in Malachi where God's like, he's like, dude, the reason everything's all effed up is because y'all didn't do the offerings. That's why everything's bad. People stop doing offerings and tithes and everything's a mess. And it's really interesting about that because the act of giving changes you as a subject. Like, to be able to give people things or to leave 10% of your field unharvested, you have to be the kind of person that is able to do that and to believe that is right. Well, now you're transforming yourself in the act of giving. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons one of the problems I do have with some of the conversations about the gift economy is it gets blurred with Keynesianism and it gets blurred with redistribution. The reason that is problematic is because me paying taxes to the government, who will then say, do the welfare state, doesn't change me the same way as directly leaving 10% of my field open. Right. And one of the reasons the gifting seems to have traditionally been important is because of how it changes you in the act of giving and it makes you be open to your community. Arguably, what has happened is a lot of people do think they give because they pay their taxes and the government takes care of the poor with the welfare state. So they actually believe that they're very giving and they actually do take a sacrifice. But here's the problem. Whenever you have law or force or it's impersonal, like you're paying taxes to the state and the state is helping the poor, right? Well, the problem with that is then it can feel like the poor could say, well, you wouldn't have done that if the government didn't do it. So it doesn't necessarily create a relationship. And also it's impersonal. You're doing it because it's against the law not to do it. Right? So it's actually from a place of kind of fear, right? But it's so similar to gifting. It's so close enough that you can convince yourself that you are gifting and you are taking care of other people. So unfortunately, even though I'm not, now we could have a larger discussion on, is the welfare state good? When is it good? Which programs are good? That's a policy question. But the point is, one of the mistakes is the conflation of all of these terms. When you're talking about like the welfare state, the gift economy, Keynesian, the Keynesian structure, or maybe redistribution, these are not going to similarly shape the subject or the person. Now, that doesn't mean Keynesianism is wrong. That's a different conversation. But what kind of happens is in the conversation, those are all just kind of moved between. And a lot of the idea of the gift economy is that it changes people or it creates a kind of new communal, or a lot of times the conversation is in the commons. A number of people I've heard talk about it. It's kind of the commons debate, right? Like we need a new commons, right? Well, that means the way you go about gifting is really important, because if you do gifting through taxes, that is not going to create a new commons, even if there's a kind of gifting that occurs, because it's not going to emotionally change people in the right way. Right. Now, of course, the argument is you say, well, Dan, people suck. They're not going to gift one another and the poor won't be taken care of. So we have to have the well state. And that's where you would have the debate. But the point is, it's really, really, really important to examine the precise mechanism of the gifting to see if it indeed changes people or if it indeed is communal building in the same way. Like you mentioned the blacksmith and different things. Well, it's really important. The blacksmith, like you probably helped him build his house. He probably helped build your house. Your kids probably know one another. You probably dropped him off a chicken one day for a Christmas dinner, and he probably dropped you off a pig. Like there's more than just like when you have that communal relationship. The key is that there are many interactions beyond just the economic exchange, of which then make you trust the economic exchange, but is not reducible to the economic exchange because you have those communal elements, right? Well, that means there's a lot of gifting around the exchange, right? There's a lot of like gifting in the community. Like, yeah, you had to pay for the blacksmith work, but you didn't have to pay for the pig, nor did they have to pay for you watching their kids while they had to go off and do something in the field, right? So there's this reciprocity that goes back and forth and back and forth that changes you, which gives you a healthy relationship with economic exchange, where you say, well, it's just business here, and you can meaningfully in your head tell a difference between the just business exchange of the blacksmith and the exchange at Christmas. Like you can meaningfully in your head have different categories. Well, what ends up happening is when the communal is replaced with the suburbia or the corporation, is those categories do this, bloop, they blur, and you can't tell the difference anymore, and they can't emotionally shape you as a subject in the same way. Likewise, once you introduce the welfare state, the category of gifting and paying taxes, boop, they blur, and you can't tell the difference anymore, and they can't shape the subject in the same manner. So you have to go through those distinctions and kind of discuss, it's like, okay, what should a healthy welfare state look like, as opposed to one that unintentionally removes the transformative impacts of gifting on the subject? And you go, okay, what's healthy business relationships that doesn't create where the guy who does your meat you never see again and you don't care about his kid, right? How do you work against that? But that, for me, the gift economy conversation has to kind of move through those distinctions between redistribution, welfare, Keynesian economics, and kind of going through what those look like. But there's no doubt that religion, like traditionally, if you grant me this term, that religions seem to have really understood that if humans don't have a giving heart, it's bad. Like they don't form right. Like, and maybe, well, there's something about giving that says you're not the center of the world, right? Like if you give up your money, that means a few things. One, that means the world outside your head is real, right? Like that's a big problem. People don't feel like anything is real, right? But if you give your money to the outside world, then it kind of helps you feel like you're not in a simulation. Whereas if you never give your money to other people, yeah, it may be a simulation. Look, I'm all in my self-enclosed tube. So giving does something, especially like money, because money is hard to get. So you really are giving something up that costs you, and you're giving it to this outer world. So you must believe it's real. So it trains you to treat what is outside of your head as real. That's one thing it does. Right. Oh, and it also trains you to think that it matters because you should give it money and you should give to other people. So it transforms kind of the ontological status of the world around you into something that feels a whole lot less like a simulation and a whole lot more like something that is there and that you should care about. And then if you're giving to people in the community, what are you doing? You're helping create the community. So you're engaged in a creative act, right? And everyone benefits from this. You change as a subject to be a better person who doesn't feel like you're in a simulation. They have their problem taken care of, and that can create a feedback loop in the same way that if you write a story, you give it to people, you can open horizons to them, they can have appreciation, maybe it inspires them to write something that gives back, and then you have a feedback loop. Basically, all social feedback loops, now, you're always in a feedback loop, but like the positive ones tend to have creativity at their core. There's some sort of creative act that is at the core of these kind of positive feedback loops. And basically giving is a kind of social creative act, because what are you doing? You're basically like, if you're in a hard capitalist economy, hyper-real, whatever the term is we want to use, when you give someone money, it's a kind of revolution. It's a kind of rebellion. You're kind of, it can be seen that way depending on where you are. Like you're giving $50, like, I'm giving it to them, not because they did something, because I value them. It kind of stands in contrast. It's almost like Deleuzian imperceivable, that imperceptibility that Deleuze talks about. It's kind of like not calculatable. Like I think the algorithms are going to have a lot harder time capturing giving than they will just economic exchange, right? Because giving is much more difficult to grasp, to kind of capture and to calculate. Likewise, the creative act is much more difficult for the algorithm to capture and direct in different things. So there's also something about giving, and then I'll give it back to you. There's also something about giving that can help lead to a positive imperceptibility of Deleuze. I think sometimes the Deleuzian, and Justin Murphy has a good video on this, sometimes the imperceptibility in Deleuze leads to everyone being obscure, atomized, and just kind of weird. And that's not really good, but there's also a lot of truth to the imperceptibility. But this kind of imperceptibility that comes from the creative act and from giving is different than merely being obscure or expressing your personality, because capitalism loves it when you express your personality, because you got to buy products to express your personality. So that's all great. So that's where, unfortunately, that's the part of like where all these corporations are like, hey, we're going to help you find meaning. Come work for Google. You can use the meaning conversation to capture people, right? So you have to always avoid that. And giving is a kind of way that you can kind of stand outside. You can change yourself as a subject where you're not. And therefore, that means you are right there positioning yourself to live according to values that are not reducible to the socioeconomic system. Because you're saying this, I value this. So you stand outside of it. Like in that very act, there's a kind of standing outside of it. If we go back to religions, like that would be, it's very interesting that giving is, because like the moment you give, it's basically saying like the world is not everything. Which of course religions believe, right? There's another dimension, there's something more. Like if you're giving, then you are not bound by the logic of the world. There is another kind of trans logic. There's a kind of higher logic. There's a kind of higher way of being that is in operation that the act of giving attunes you to. Where if you don't give, you may believe in it, but you're not attuned to it because it hasn't made you pay a price. So there's something about a giving as a kind of practice that attunes you to alternative ways of living that then makes you less capturable and engaging in something more creative to do something more. So giving, I think, is very, very important to the attunement of these higher possibilities or something more.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And the I think what I was getting when you were saying that was like the gift economy is in its more simple or naive forms, it can just be like, oh, if you like transactionally do something, it will transactionally come back to you, which is not at all what I think that the message is there. It's not like, hey, let's keep everything the same and just like change how we relate to transactions so that maybe it'll come back to you, but more so like, no, like if you give some, I really like the ending there when you said like it attunes us to something that is like transrational, you know, and I've been thinking about that a lot recently and diving a lot deeper into some of the like religious worldviews as well to really see like what you know, I would always like kind of dismiss religion at face value because you know like the propositions of it make no sense a lot of the times, and it's like it's very hard, like a lot of the modern, you know, scientific worldviews from a propositional standpoint make a lot more sense. But I was like, oh, maybe I'll just do it and see if there's like some other type of transformation that comes with engaging in some maybe religious activity. And I started like noticing of like, oh yeah, still like the beliefs of it still kind of hard for me to like get behind, but you know there's this feeling I get when I engage in this like religious community or like, and it's like this like ontological like transformation, like I feel like I'm putting myself in relation to something that's beyond just this world, and that relationship to that something that's beyond this world, that's like meaningful, and that helps me relate to this world in a different way. And in the same way, like, you know, living from this very like reductionistic culture, like it can feel like, oh, like everything is just transactional, I can just reduce everything, like, oh, like I just need to be selfish and I need to like keep everything for myself. But like I feel like it's hard for a lot of us that like grew up in this like that are so influenced by this modern worldview, like just growing up in it, it's just everywhere, right? And it's just like it's hard to see. I feel like giving is almost like you said, giving is sometimes like contradicts this idea that everything is transactional, that like this kind of just like we can just reduce everything down to its simplest part. But giving actually, it's like almost like rebellion against the core ontological assumptions of our world that say that we are here, everything else is out there, there's a separation, I shouldn't care about anything out there because all I should care about is my own survival and here, and everything out there is meaningless as long as I can just survive and be my own separated from the rest of reality and from the world. And it almost says like, no, like actually there's some sort of interdependence or some sort of relationship that is important, rather than like I think that's like another part of it is like the reductionistic capitalistic one is like, oh, they're like, it kind of takes away the relationship between like me and the economic system, and it's just like I'm just transacting, I'm just getting what I need, who cares where the money goes, whereas like, oh, I'm actually participating in this, I'm in this active relationship with this sometimes transactional but sometimes beyond that, and that's why I can give, because there's this relationship that I'm having with the world, with other, that is very important and meaningful, in a way that a lot of times I can't comprehend. There's no like certainty again. There's no like certainty there, and yeah, just kind of riffing on.
No, that's outstanding. So a few things. One's relationship with money may be the number one influence on their attunement. And I know that Mr. Vivek has been talking a lot about attunement and practices of attuning and different things like that. And all of that plays a role. What I think is so important to realize is that basically our attunement to the world is our relationship with money. Should it be? That's an entirely different question. And the reason is this, because money costs you something. To get money, it's hard. So you have to spend your time. You might have done things you didn't want to do. It may have really cost you something. So money is not merely it's kind of like a psychotechnology too. Like it's not merely there's like it's like a psychotechnology, like psychological technology. So when I know that I got up at 5 a.m. to do stuff I didn't want to do to get this $50, and I'm going to give it to someone without getting anything for that, they didn't have to get up at 5 a.m. They didn't have to deal with the crazy person on the phone, but I'm going to give it to them. That's very, very hard. That's extremely difficult. It's one thing if you inherit a bunch of money and do it, and that doesn't necessarily transform the subject. But when it requires you to get, and that's why like Jesus in the New Testament is like, hey, you see that poor woman who put that money in the tithe? That's way more valuable than the kings who are like, just doing all these treasure chests and different things, because that didn't cost the kings anything. They as subjects did not have to suffer that giving. But when we talk about giving as a kind of suffering, you could maybe say crucifixion in a kind of Christian sense, right? That is really transformative. That is really difficult. And that makes you have kind of a serving mindset as well, right? You're thinking about the other person. You're not just thinking about what you did to earn this money and how difficult it was and what you had to do. You're thinking about in the context of, yes, those things had to be done. And yet still, there is something important about being willing to give and to be there for other people. An entirely different mindset, an entirely different psychology that is really, really transformative. And therefore, it attunes you. You're attuned differently. And so what has occurred, if we use the Viveki language of attunement, is that we're all attuned to capitalism. We're all attuned to exchange. We're all attuned to reductionism. We're all attuned to these different things. But you see, basically, I think like until the way we use money changes attunement perhaps most profoundly of all. Now, I don't want to take that too far, but I definitely think the question of money has a massive influence on attunement. And if it's not part of the conversation, I do question how much other methods of attunement can change us, other than maybe on the weekend when we're not at work. Because money costs us so much. Money is so difficult because it's a psychotechnology. Now, when we talk about giving, I'm not saying that, say, economic exchanges are always bad. I'm not saying the pricing mechanism is bad. Basically, as you get a more complicated system, you will need a pricing mechanism to coordinate all the resources. It becomes a necessary thing. But here's the issue. This is the problem. It becomes very difficult for, if you have like family, local, state, federal, globe or something, if I were to use American terms. It's very difficult for us if at the top of the stack is pricing mechanisms, it becomes very difficult for that to not bleed into all floors of the stack and become the defining metric of all floors. What you need is to have pricing mechanisms in globalization, for example, so you can have the supply chains. But as you move toward the family, there should be way more giving as you go down the step, right? There should be way more of different kind of exchanges than merely monetary exchange. But it's very difficult for humans to do that because we do this thing where we associate right with biggest. Like if the big system is price mechanisms and economic exchange, well, that must be what everything should do. Because we basically define every layer of the stack. There's kind of this reductionism upward. Like we reduce everything to the top on global systems. We say, oh, everything should be like that. It's kind of like a inverted reductionism. I don't know what term I want to use now. Maybe like a negative emergentism or something, where we're like, oh, everything should follow the logic of the global system, right? Or the logic of big corporations or different things. No. In fact, if you do that, you're just going to become a corporation in a sense. You're going to become a kind of empty, hollow shell that only cares about your equity value or something like that, right? So it's just what has to happen is as you move from the top of the stack down, the role of alternative exchanges becomes utterly necessary to avoid attuning for us attuning ourselves to basically being just pawns in a giant kind of global board that then doesn't have personality, because of course it doesn't. The global system is mostly mathematical. It's prices, it's numerical. And if you define yourself by those exchanges, then you just become numbers, basically. You become like walking impersonal numbers. And that's what I think you see occurring. So it's very important as you move down the stack to do things like giving. And you can give your time, you can give your money, and people say time is money. So there is something about giving your time that costs you as well. But sometimes there's not something that you can give your time for that is what the person needs. So you have to have the money option in order to experience that psychological challenge and attunement. So you have the option to helping them in different ways. But definitely pouring yourself into something that costs you, that then is given to others, is it's an utterly crucial practice of the ecology of practices that radically shapes attunement. It may be the thing that shapes it most of all.
Yeah, I've never heard that you know, how we relate to money is how we, you know, attune to the world. I think that's spot on, you know, when you're saying that. It completely matched up with my experience. And yeah, I really enjoyed the nuance that you brought to the like transactional stuff is not bad, you know, like on a mass scale, like price point mechanism is like it's good, but within the family, if you bring that down to the family and your closest relationships and your most cherished relationships, then probably going to be a really bad idea. So I like that nuance of like not always bad, not always good, but like in this context, it's probably all right. And in this one, you probably don't want to focus completely on transactional relationships. And yeah, I'm always fascinated with our talks here, Daniel, and I'm fascinated with how we can tie so many different philosophical and economic and creative topics all together into a coherent conversation, and it always lights me up, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Well, I always enjoy it, and I appreciate you working through our internet struggles. Well, and I think but just to close, I think it's a very important conversation. I enjoyed very much, and I think, and again, to say that money has a massive influence on attunement does not mean, obviously, that different practices like writing or different things don't have a role. It's just in the conversation. I don't know if money is even considered as part of the conversation of attunement and how that changes us, and it must. Because it completely orientates us in the world. And again, you know, to close the point, if indeed thought is not in the business of certainty and it has something to do with confidence, it does seem to be that a role of thought is to actually take fragments and bring them into mosaics, to see how things go together and inform one another, and to be following the relations between, say, money, writing, forming the subject, ontology, epistemology. And we have not even arguably for the last 200 years been focused on thinking that way, because we've been using thinking to reduce to something we can be certain of. But what we're seeing now is once we kind of remove that possibility, thought is in the business of these relations and bringing them together and seeing what emerges from those relations so that we can have high order complexity understanding, not merely low order complexity understanding. And thinking seems to be more in the business of the high order than the low order, of the creative, not merely the causal, of what can come creatively emerge and that is possible, as opposed to what is already there that we're simply looking at. We've for far too long had thought simply be in the business of looking at things that are already there, as opposed to thinking of what could be there if we only figured out how to bring things together. So I think this is the kind of thinking that becomes very important. So I always appreciate the chance to speak to you in line with that kind of thinking. So thank you very much, Ethan. It's always a pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, sir.